When we analyze the astonishing speed of Japan's modernization following the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the narrative often centers solely on internal political genius and efficiency. But this view is fundamentally incomplete. To truly understand why Japan transformed so radically and so quickly, we must reposition the failures and fortunes of its neighbors, China and Korea, from background context to central causes. These two nations provided Japan with both the critical negative example it desperately needed to avoid and the strategic geographic pressure point required to forge a unified national defense policy. This complex relationship acted as the primary external engine that drove Japan from feudal isolation to regional power status in a span of mere decades, setting the stage for 20th century Asian geopolitics. The most powerful catalyst for Japanese change was the spectacular decline of the Qing dynasty in China. For centuries, China had been regarded by Japan as the immutable center of Asian civilization and wisdom. This perception shattered with the advent of the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. Japanese observers, acutely aware of geopolitical movements, tracked the devastating defeats, the humiliating Treaty of Nanking, and the subsequent carving up of Chinese sovereignty by Western powers. This was not a distant political event. It was a terrifying, tangible blueprint for national failure. It proved that sheer size, cultural legacy, and tradition offered absolutely no defense against modern industrial military power. This exposure instilled a profound sense of urgency among the Japanese elite: modernize or suffer the same fate, becoming another colony in waiting. The Japanese response was meticulous intelligence gathering. Unlike the Qing court, which largely dismissed the Westerners as sea barbarians whose technology was temporary, Japanese intellectuals and domain leaders engaged in intensive study. Through rangaku, or Dutch learning, and later direct observation missions to China and Europe, reformers deduced that China's primary weaknesses were structural: its decentralized government, its entrenched scholarly bureaucracy resistant to change, and critically, its failure to adopt modern military logistics and weaponry. Japan concluded that the Qing's self-strengthening movement was too localized and too little too late. This analysis provided the Meiji reformers with a clear roadmap. Centralized power was mandatory, and the adoption of Western technology and institutions had to be absolute, efficient, and immediate, specifically to ensure defensive integrity against Western aggression. Turning our focus to the Korean peninsula, its role was primarily geographic and strategic, acting as a crucial bridge and flashpoint. Historically, Joseon Korean was Japan's primary conduit for advanced continental culture, from sophisticated Confucian thought to printing technology. However, by the 19th century, Korea represented a deep strategic vulnerability. Japanese strategists, haunted by the specter of Russia or another Western power establishing a foothold in Korea, a mere 50 miles from Japan's shores, viewed the peninsula as a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. The survival of an independent yet weak Korean kingdom was deemed an existential threat, forcing Japan to prioritize military development and expansionist diplomacy to preempt Western control over the region. The strategic tension materialized sharply in 1876 with the Gonghwa Island incident, sometimes known as the Unyo incident. This was Japan's first significant act of modern gunboat diplomacy, a move directly copied from Commodore Perry's playbook used against Japan itself just 2 decades prior. By forcing the unequal Treaty of Gonghwa upon the Joseon dynasty, Japan established consular rights, opened Korean ports, and critically secured recognition of Korea as an independent state, meaning independent from Qing China's traditional suzerainty. This was a pivotal moment. Japan had successfully tested its nascent modern military capacity, provided its reformers with a vital diplomatic victory, and established a crucial, irreversible wedge between China and Korea, securing its own strategic advantage and providing a testing ground for its future imperial ambitions. The collective trauma and urgency derived from observing China's collapse and managing the Korean strategic challenge fundamentally shifted the domestic political atmosphere in Japan. The initial rallying cry of the anti-shogunate movement, Son no Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, proved politically unviable after Western naval forces decisively defeated local domains like Choshu and Satsuma. The reformers realized that expulsion was not possible without first achieving military parity. This created the necessary intellectual and political space for the Meiji coup d'état. The external threat, primarily embodied by the fate of the Qing, provided the absolute justification for radical internal change, allowing the new government to overcome traditional resistance to centralizing power, dismantling the feudal structure, and adopting sweeping Western reforms overnight. The Meiji reformers masterfully used the geopolitical pressures originating from China and Korea to consolidate power under the emperor. They argued, successfully, that national survival was contingent upon total unity and military strength. This allowed them to eliminate the decentralized domain system, Han system, and establish a cohesive, modern state apparatus far more quickly than China, which was constantly paralyzed by regional warlords and conflicting bureaucratic interests. The foreign menace, exemplified by Qing humiliation, was the primary tool used to forge a unified national identity that transcended regional loyalties. Every piece of legislation, from conscription laws to mandatory education, was framed as a necessity driven by the dire external circumstances seen playing out just across the sea. Crucially, Japan's modernization was selective and strategic. Unlike China, which attempted piecemeal adoption, Japan adopted models based on functional efficiency, specifically targeting those systems that would maximize national strength while avoiding the bureaucratic and financial failures observed in the Qing court. They adopted the German legal framework and constitutional monarchy, the British Navy structure, and mandatory military conscription based on Western models. This efficiency was directly tied to the urgent need to outpace the decay seen in their continental neighbor. Every adoption was filtered through the pragmatic question: will this make us powerful enough to avoid becoming China? This focused, centralized approach ensured that their limited resources were invested optimally in building Fukoku Kyohei, a rich country and a strong army. The push toward industrialization and military development required immense capital. Here again, the strategic interest in Korea played a massive economic role. Securing influence and control over Korea provided Japan with access to raw materials and, more importantly, a captive market and geopolitical leverage necessary to finance its expensive modernization projects without becoming entirely indebted to Western powers. The nascent zaibatsu, industrial conglomerates, benefited immensely from early concessions and trade advantages secured in Korea, which acted as an immediate economic proving ground and source of extraction. The profits and resources flowing from the peninsula subsidized the steel mills, textile factories, and shipyards that formed the backbone of Japan's economic miracle, proving that external expansion was integral to internal development. The ultimate test and final consequence of these dynamics arrived with the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-1895. Thought primarily over control and influence in Korea, the war was a stunning, brutal display of Japan's successful modernization versus China's continuing systemic failure. The Japanese Imperial Army and Navy, utilizing modern organization and technology, decisively crushed the Qing forces, resulting in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. This treaty inverted the historical hierarchy of East Asia. China was forced to cede Taiwan, grant favorable trade terms, pay massive indemnities, and formally recognized the full and complete independence of Korea, which everyone understood meant handing control over to Japan. This victory legitimized Japan's regional dominance and earned it the begrudging respect of Western powers, confirming its status as the only industrialized non-Western military power. In conclusion, the roles of China and Korea were indispensable in catalyzing the Meiji Restoration. China served as the necessary negative model, a stark cautionary tale that justified radical political and military consolidation. Korea served as the strategic imperative, a geographical vulnerability that demanded immediate militarization and expansionist diplomacy. The speed, focus, and effectiveness of Japanese modernization were all calibrated against the immediate and visible evidence of their neighbors' struggles. However, the tragedy of this cause and effect relationship is that the geopolitical threat that fueled Japan's defense quickly morphed into an engine of imperialism. The very nations whose misfortunes spurred Japan to action became the first victims of the powerful modern state they inadvertently create, setting the stage for decades of regional conflict and domination. Understanding the Meiji Restoration through this lens, as a defensive reaction spurred by regional chaos, offers a far more complex and complete picture of modern history. The modernization of Japan was fundamentally a geopolitical act of survival, with its path paved by the failures of the Qing and the strategic necessity of controlling the Korean peninsula. Thank you for delving into this complex history with us. If this analysis broadened your understanding of East Asian geopolitics, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates.